Hello and welcome to Theatre Beard, the YouTube channel specifically for students of theatre and performance studies, drama and the performing arts, particularly those studying BTEC and GCSE and indeed the International Baccalaureate, or for anybody who's just got a bit of an interest. Today's video is all about pantomime.
Oh no it isn't!
Oh yes it is. But before we get started, don't forget to like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel because there's plenty more videos to come. Once you've watched this video, you might want to go back and check out the interview that I did with Sam Raybone. He is a professional pantomime dame and he's also a panto director. So if you want to find out more about what it's like to be in a panto, to be a working pantomime dame, or to be a director and what it takes to put together one of those huge productions, then it's a really great video to watch because this one is going to be mainly about the history of pantomime. So let's get started. Pantomime is often seen as something that is uniquely British, but its roots are actually in Commedia dell'arte back in the 16th century in Italy, with comedic moments, stock characters and great physicality. In the late 1600s, characters from Commedia dell'arte started to appear in English plays, and they were brought here by the theatre impresario John Rich. At the centre of many of these stories was the acrobatic Harlequin, or as the Commedia dell'arte call him, Arlecchino, but he'd evolved into some kind of impish magician by the time that he'd arrived on English shores. And because the central character was Harlequin, the plays themselves became known as Harlequinades, and this was a really early form of pantomime. Now you might be familiar with part of the word pantomime, mime, meaning a wordless performance, and this was because these early productions of Harlequinades were wordless. They were just mimed performances, and this was because the venues that they were performed in didn't have a license for spoken performances, so they were all completely silent, and this evolved into pantomime. The stories in Harlequinades would involve lovers, magic, chases, acrobatics, and Harlequin would use his slapstick to hit the scenery, and this would instigate the set changes. Now you might have heard the word slapstick before because we use it to describe physical performances, usually that people come to some physical harm in. So if someone's been hit, or if somebody drops something on their toe, or if someone gets smacked in the face with something, we usually call that a slapstick performance, particularly and especially if it's comedic. And we get the word slapstick from these performances. Harlequin, the character, was considered to be quite magical, and he carried around with him a large stick that had a hinged flap so it would make a slapping sound, and this was used as both a sword and a kind of magic wand. And even to this very day you can see traces of this in the pantos that you've perhaps seen at the theatre. If there's ever been a comedic moment on stage and you've heard a hit of the drums in the orchestra, that's basically what the slapstick was for. That ba-dum-tsh. As I mentioned earlier, this was also used to be able to control the action and dictate when the scenes would change, because often Harlequinades were semi-improvised and it was really Harlequin that was in charge of how the show ran. The actor playing Harlequin would know when the scenes were to change, and he would clap his slapstick as a kind of audible cue to let people know that the scene needed to be changed there and then. So in the 1600s, which is the 17th century, these performances were known as Harlequinades, and then in the 18th century, the 1700s, that's when we first see the word pantomime used, and a ballet pantomime was produced, The Loves of Mars and Venus, in 1717, followed by The Harlequin Sorcerer, and both of these productions were produced by John Rich, who I mentioned at the very start, and he played Harlequin in both of those performances. We generally know pantomime as a Christmas event, and Harlequinades were performed all year round, and they became so popular that other people wanted to produce them as well. So you might have heard of David Garrick. There's an awful lot of theatres that are named the Garrick Theatre after David Garrick, and he wanted to produce a pantomime at Drury Lane. His was slightly different though, because there was a little less emphasis on mime and the Harlequin was able to speak. So by 1773, the first ever production of a pantomime that's a direct descendant of the pantomimes we see today was produced at Drury Lane by David Garrick, and it was their production of Jack the Giant Killer, which is the same story as we know as Jack and the Beanstalk. However, with the arrival of pantomime, that didn't mean that Harlequinades stopped. They were still produced, and in fact they were usually short pieces that were performed at the end of tragic plays because they were there to lift people's spirits. Then at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 19th century, pantomime gets its first star in the form of clown Joseph Grimaldi. And Joseph Grimaldi is such a well-respected clown that clowns to this day have also got the nickname Joeys out of his memory. And he was such a huge star at the time with songs, slapstick, all the things that we expect from pantomimes nowadays were really instigated by Joseph Grimaldi, and crowds would flock to see his performances at Sadler's Wells and Drury Lane and would often leave the theatre singing his songs and talking about his performance. So everybody loved Joseph Grimaldi. So, as well as helping to secure the tradition of comedy songs and slapstick, Joseph Grimaldi actually pioneered a big feature of panto performances that we still experience to this day. Yes, Joseph Grimaldi was the first ever panto dame. He played the role of Queen Rondabelliana in Harlequin and the Red Dwarf, and also Dame Cecily Suet in Harlequin Whittington. That's not to say that Joseph Grimaldi was the first ever man to play a woman on stage, because obviously this theatrical tradition harks back to the days of Shakespeare, where females weren't allowed on the stage, so all of the female parts were played by boys and men. Even in the Restoration period, when women were allowed on the stage, often the older parts or the comedic parts were played by men as well. And some of this is because the younger actresses who were allowed on the stage for the first time simply weren't old enough to play the older parts, and also didn't really want to play ones that would make them look ugly and hideous. By the time we get to the Victorian period, pantomime is firmly rooted as a Christmas tradition, and the telling of traditional fairy stories and Robinson Crusoe becomes a traditional story. All of these performances also include witty songs and topical content from that time. And it's during the Victorian period that we start to see women playing the principal boy role, and this very often was so Victorian gentlemen could see a lady in tights. Because obviously during that period ladies were expected to cover up and would wear very modest frocks, so the only chance they got to get a glimpse of a lady's leg is at a pantomime. However, because times have changed and now ladies can wear pretty much whatever they wish, then that tradition kind of went by the wayside, and very often the principal boy is usually played by a male identifying actor. This period saw the rise of music hall performances with comic routines and comedy songs, and it saw the demise of the Harlequinade. Stars from the world of variety and music hall started to infiltrate the world of pantomime, and they brought with them topical comedy and comedy routines and songs. And theatrical impresario Augustus Harris actually encouraged theatres to compete with each other and thought that the performances needed to be a lot more lavish and over the top, a much bigger production. And the last Harlequinade was performed in London at the Lyceum Theatre in 1939, but panto still exists today. One of the reasons pantomime has been able to stick around is because it's been able to adapt. And in the 1930s and 1940s, stars from the radio would often appear in pantomimes. And that tradition is kept through to today, with stars from television and celebrities and sports personalities very often appear in pantomimes. And it provides young people usually their very first experience of going to the theatre. As you can tell, pantomime has got a very rich heritage, and a lot of the traditions continue to this day. Some of the elements to look out for: to begin with, there's usually a very strong story, and it's usually a familiar story, a fable or a fairy tale that involves the battle between good and evil, and of course, good always triumphs. There's even a tradition that says that the villain should be the first person to enter from stage left, immediately followed by the good fairy from stage right. And this harks back to the medieval days from the morality plays, when hell was stage left and heaven was stage right. In pantomimes, there's usually some kind of panto animal. So this might be a pantomime cow, particularly in shows like Jack and the Beanstalk, or indeed a pantomime horse. Some productions even use real animals. I've seen productions of Cinderella where they use Shetland ponies to pull on the carriage at the end for Cinderella. I've also seen huge mechanical dragons and even Chinese lions. As I mentioned earlier on, there's an emphasis on slapstick comedy, where people are getting hit with things, slipping over, all that kind of stuff. But there's also an added element in some pantos, and it's quite rare that you see this nowadays, but if you search them out, there are one or two pantos that still do it, and that is the slosh routine, which is basically a slapstick routine that involves wet stuff like water, custard pies, but sometimes it can be dry stuff like flour if there's a baking scene. And I'm sure you're all familiar with a huge sing-along. So usually at the end of the pantomime, a big song sheet will appear on a cloth behind the actors, and the audience are expected to join in singing along with a song. And throughout the whole performance, there's an awful lot of breaking the fourth wall, so that the actors on stage can directly refer to the audience, and the audience are expected to shout out that "he's behind you," that kind of thing. However, something I learned from my interview with pantomime dame Sam Raybone is that there's a tradition of having only particular characters being able to break the fourth wall, and one of those is the dame. So check out that interview with Sam if you haven't already for more information all about pantomimes. Thank you so much for joining me for this video. Do check out all of the other videos on the channel, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.